At 19, a frightened girl is forced to marry the most ruthless mountain man in the Colorado Territory. The townsfolk whisper he's killed men with his bare hands, that she won't last a week in his cabin high in the snow. But when the fire burns low and the blizzard closes in, something unexpected happens. Instead of cruelty, he gives her his coat. Instead of chains, he gives her freedom. Yet behind his silence lies a secret darker than the storm, a buried sin the law is riding hard to uncover. And when the past comes for them, mercy will demand more courage than any gunfight. Now the whole valley is watching, breath held, hearts pounding, because what that mountain man does next will test every notion of justice, faith, and love left in the West. Can a man once called Ruthless prove redemption is real? Or will the frontier claim another soul to the cold? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Through the frosted glass of the saloon window, moonlight cast long shadows across worn floorboards. Alice Mae Trenton clutched her thin shawl tighter, her wedding ring catching the dim lamplight. The metal felt foreign and cold against her skin. Around her, the raucous sounds of the saloon had faded to whispers and sidelong glances. Even the piano player had fallen silent. Her father lay slumped at the card table, reeking of whiskey and defeat. The stack of coins and bills before him had dwindled to nothing over the past hours. She'd watched it happen, helpless, as he wagered everything he had, and then wagered her. "Ain't right," muttered old Joe behind the bar, polishing the same glass he'd been cleaning for the past hour. "Girl like that, given away like cattle." The preacher who'd performed the ceremony stood in the corner, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. His hands still trembled. Nobody in town had ever seen Andrew Stone enter the saloon before tonight, much less demand a wedding. The mountain man's reputation preceded him. Tales of ruthlessness, of savage fights, of years spent living wild in Apache territory. Alice stole another glance at her new husband. Andrew Stone stood by the door, his massive frame blocking most of the exit. The lamplight caught the deep scar that ran from his left temple to jaw, disappearing into his beard. His buckskins were worn, but clean, his rifle well maintained. Everything about him spoke of careful attention to detail. Everything except the sudden marriage to a stranger. He hadn't spoken a word to her since the ceremony, hadn't even looked at her properly. Just paid the barkeep 2 bits for the preacher's trouble and told her to gather what she needed for the journey. His voice was low and gravelly, as if unused to speech. "Girl needs a proper coat," old Joe ventured, setting down his glass. "Mountains ain't kind in winter." Andrew's dark eyes flicked to the barkeep. Muscle twitched in his jaw. Without a word, he shrugged off his own heavy wool coat and held it out to Alice. The gesture surprised her, and from the murmurs in the room, surprised everyone else too. Her fingers trembled as she took it. The coat was warm from his body, smelling of wood smoke and pine. It draped past her knees, enormous on her slight frame. "Much obliged," she whispered, but he had already turned away, heading out to check the wagon. Alice's father stirred, lifting his head from the table. His bleary eyes found her, and something like shame crossed his face. "May," he slurred, using her middle name as he always had. "I didn't mean—" "Save your breath, Trenton," old Joe cut in, his voice hard. "You've done enough." Alice felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She'd learned long ago that crying didn't change anything. Instead, she gathered the small carpet bag containing everything she owned. 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a hairbrush, and a daguerreotype of her mother in happier days. The wagon waited outside, two sturdy mules stamping in the snow. Andrew had already loaded supplies: flour, coffee, salt pork, ammunition, everything needed for mountain living. He'd planned this, she realized. He'd come to town for a wife, and her father's gambling had provided one. The moon hung full and cold in the sky as Alice climbed onto the wagon seat. Andrew didn't offer help, though she noticed him watching to make sure she was settled before moving to tend to the mules. The harnesses needed adjusting, he'd said, the only words he'd spoken to her directly. From her perch, Alice watched him work. His movements were efficient, practiced. Nothing wasted. The moonlight silvered his dark hair, and she could see strands of gray at his temples. He was older than she'd first thought, maybe 15 years her senior. His hands, when they worked the leather straps, were scarred but gentle with the animals. The saloon door creaked open, spilling lamplight onto the snow. Old Joe emerged, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. "Here," he said gruffly, handing it up to Alice. "Some bread and cheese for the journey, and—" He hesitated, glancing at Andrew, who had paused in his work. "There's a mission up near Bear Creek. Couple days' ride. Good people there if you need them." Alice understood what he wasn't saying. If she needed escape. If the rumors about Andrew Stone proved true. "Thank you," she said softly, tucking the package into her carpet bag. Andrew straightened, checking the harnesses one final time. The mule's breath steamed in the cold air, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The sound made Alice shiver despite the heavy coat. Without a word, Andrew swung up beside her. The wagon seat wasn't wide, but he kept careful space between them. He gathered the reins, clicked his tongue, and the mules started forward. The wagon wheels creaked through the fresh snow. Alice didn't look back at the saloon, at her father, at the only life she'd known. She fixed her eyes on the snow-swept road ahead, white and endless in the moonlight. Beside her, Andrew Stone was a silent presence, as much a stranger now as he'd been when he'd first walked into the saloon hours ago. The town fell away behind them. The only sounds were the jingling of harnesses, the crunch of snow under wheel and hoof, and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Alice's hands, clasped tight in her lap, had gone numb with cold despite the coat's warmth. They passed the town's cemetery, iron crosses stark against the snow. Alice thought of her mother's grave, 3 states back, abandoned like so many things in her father's restless wandering. She wished, not for the first time, that she had her mother's strength. Sarah Trenton had faced hardship with grace and an unshakable faith that good would prevail. Looking at her new husband's stern profile, at the rugged mountain country looming ahead, Alice wondered if faith alone would be enough for what lay ahead. The mules plodded onward, their pace steady but unhurried. Andrew handled them with quiet confidence, anticipating drifts, guiding them around icy patches. His attention never wavered from the task at hand, though Alice felt he was aware of every movement she made, every shiver she tried to suppress. When they passed the last homestead, its windows dark and shuttered against the night, Alice felt truly alone for the first time. The wilderness ahead seemed to stretch forever, mysterious and threatening. Yet beside her sat a man who clearly knew these mountains, who moved through them with the ease of long familiarity. The moon tracked across the sky as they traveled. Andrew stopped twice to check the mules, to adjust straps and offer them water. Each time, he worked in silence, his movements economical and sure. He didn't speak to Alice, but she noticed him watching to ensure she was still wrapped warmly in his coat. Near midnight, a barn owl swooped across their path, its wings ghostly in the moonlight. The mules shied, but Andrew's steady hands kept them true. Alice found herself studying those hands. Strong, capable, marked with the story of a hard life. They weren't the hands of a cruel man, she thought. Dangerous, perhaps, but not cruel. The night grew colder. Alice's breath frosted in the air, and she huddled deeper into Andrew's coat. The wool still held his warmth, and beneath the wood smoke, she caught the faint scent of coffee and leather. Common smells, ordinary things, yet somehow comforting in their familiarity. They crested a rise, and the valley spread before them, white and silent under the moon. In the distance, mountain peaks thrust up against the star-filled sky like teeth. Somewhere in those mountains lay Andrew Stone's home, and now she supposed her home too. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange calm settle over her. Whatever came next, she would face it with the quiet, strength her mother had taught her. She would find a way to build a life, even here, even with this silent, scarred man whom fate had given her for a husband. The wagon rolled on through the night, carrying them deeper into the wilderness. Alice sat straight beside Andrew, her eyes on the snow-swept road, while he tended the mules in the moonlight. Neither spoke, but the silence between them had shifted somehow, no longer purely fearful on her part, no longer completely unreadable on his. Dawn broke in pale ribbons across the eastern sky. Frost glittered on the wagon's wooden boards as Andrew hitched the mules, his breath forming clouds in the bitter morning air. Alice huddled deeper into his coat, watching him work. Her fingers, despite the wool gloves old Joe's wife had pressed into her hands, felt stiff with cold. The road narrowed as they climbed higher into the mountains. Fresh snow lay deep between the towering pines, untouched save for deer tracks and the occasional rabbit trail. Wind whistled through the branches, carrying the sharp scent of winter. The mules plodded forward steadily, their hooves breaking through the crusty surface of the snow. Hour after hour passed in silence. Andrew kept his eyes on the trail, occasionally clicking his tongue to encourage the mules around a particularly deep drift. He stopped only when the sun reached its peak, leading the animals to a partially frozen stream. "Here." His voice was rough from disuse as he handed her a strip of jerky. Alice accepted it with trembling fingers, more from nerves than cold. It was the first word he'd spoken since they'd left town. The jerky was tough but flavorful, tasting of smoke and salt. Alice chewed slowly, watching as Andrew checked each mule's hooves for packed snow and ice. His movements were gentle, practiced. The animals seemed to trust him, standing quietly under his touch. When night began to fall, purple shadows stretching across the snow, Andrew guided the wagon off the trail. A creek, mostly frozen, gurgled faintly nearby. The site was sheltered by a stand of thick pines, their branches heavy with snow. "Stay in the wagon," he said, helping her down, "until I've cleared the space and built a fire." Alice wrapped his coat tighter around herself, watching as he worked. His axe bit into deadfall with precise strokes, clearing a space for their camp. Soon, a small fire crackled, pushing back the gathering darkness. The flames cast dancing shadows on the snow and the wagon's canvas cover. Andrew approached, holding out a tin cup of coffee. "It's hot," he warned as she took it. Their fingers brushed briefly, his calloused and warm despite the cold. She expected him to move away immediately, as he had all day. Instead, he stood there a moment, seeming to struggle with something. "You'll need the coat tonight," he said finally. "I've got another blanket." "But—" Alice started to protest. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she could see his breath in the firelight. "Keep it," he said firmly, then turned to tend the mules one last time before settling down. Alice spread her blanket near the fire, Andrew's coat adding an extra layer of warmth. She watched, surprised, as he bowed his head over his meal of jerky and hard tack. His lips moved silently in prayer, an unexpected gesture from a man the town whispered about in fear. The night passed slowly. Alice dozed fitfully, waking often to find Andrew adding wood to the fire or checking the perimeter of their camp. He never approached her blanket, keeping to his word about maintaining distance. Morning arrived with fresh snow and biting wind. They ate a cold breakfast of jerky and the last of old Joe's bread, then continued their journey. The trail grew steeper, switching back and forth across the mountainside. Near midday, they came upon a sorry sight. A traveler stood beside his fallen horse, which had slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. The man's face was drawn with worry as he tried to calm the frightened animal. Without hesitation, Andrew stopped the wagon. He approached slowly, speaking in low tones to both man and horse. His hands moved with the same gentle confidence he showed with the mules, checking the horse's legs for injury. "Nothing's broken," he said after a thorough examination, "but he'll need rest, and you're low on supplies." The traveler nodded wearily. "Was hoping to make the next town, but in this weather—" Andrew returned to the wagon, removing one of their precious sacks of flour. He carried it back to the stranded man, along with some jerky and coffee. "There's a shelter 2 miles back," he said, pointing the way they'd come. "Small cave, marked by 3 crossed sticks. Stay there until the horse is steady." The man's eyes widened at Andrew's generosity. "I can't take half your flour." "You can," Andrew said simply. "And you will. Weather's turning worse. You'll need it." Alice watched the exchange with growing wonder. This was the man people called Ruthless, who spoke of in whispers. The same hands they claimed were stained with violence were now helping a stranger's horse to its feet, ensuring both man and beast would survive the mountain winter. The days that followed blended together in a rhythm of travel and silent meals. Andrew remained distant but attentive, always ensuring Alice had enough warmth and food. Each night, she noticed him pray, though he never spoke of it. Finally, late on the 4th day, Andrew pointed ahead. There. Through the falling snow, Alice saw it, a solid cabin built of thick logs, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Her heart began to race. This was it, her new home, with a man she barely knew, whose reputation spoke of ruthlessness and danger. Andrew guided the mules into a small barn beside the cabin, taking time to settle them properly before leading Alice to the main door. Inside, the cabin was plain but well-maintained. A fire already burned in the hearth. Andrew had arranged for a neighbor to prepare for their arrival, she realized. She stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, still wearing his coat. This was the moment she'd been dreading. What would he expect? What would he demand? Andrew lit a lantern, its warm glow filling the space. Then he turned to her, his face unreadable in the shadowed light. "You'll sleep inside," he said calmly. "I'll take the floor." Before she could respond, he'd turned away, busying himself with bringing in their supplies. Alice stood there, his coat around her shoulders, watching as he moved efficiently around the cabin. Everything about him contradicted what she'd been told. His gentle hands with animals, his generosity to strangers, his quiet prayers, and now this unexpected courtesy. The fearsome Andrew Stone, it seemed, was not the man the whispers had painted him to be. As she helped him arrange their supplies, he never asked, but she couldn't stand idle. Alice felt something shift inside her. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps its first fragile seeds. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's windows. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and Andrew moved quietly around the space, laying out his bedroll on the floor near the hearth. His actions spoke louder than any words. She was safe here, with this silent, complicated man who had married her in a smoky saloon just 4 days ago. Alice clutched his coat closer, breathing in its familiar scent of wood smoke and pine. For the first time since that terrible night in the saloon, she felt something close to hope. The snow fell in thick curtains outside the cabin window as Alice stood in the middle of the single room, taking in her new home. Rough-hewn logs made up the walls, their surfaces worn smooth in places from years of touch. A narrow bunk lined one wall, its blankets military neat, with a leather-bound Bible resting on the pillow. The sight of the holy book surprised her, another contradiction in the puzzle that was Andrew Stone. Her gaze traveled to the shelves lining the opposite wall. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, their faint fragrance mixing with the scent of pine and wood smoke. Below them, an organized collection of traps and tools spoke of Andrew's trade. Everything had its place, she noticed, a stark contrast to the chaotic saloons of her childhood. The door burst open, letting in a swirl of snowflakes and cold air. Andrew ducked through, cradling something against his chest. Alice stepped back instinctively, but froze when she heard a weak cry, not human, but animal. "Found it caught in wire near the creek," Andrew said, his voice low and gentle. In his large hands lay a hawk, its feathers matted with snow and blood. One wing was tangled in cruel strands of wire, the bird's eyes fierce despite its predicament. Alice watched as Andrew set his burden carefully on the table. His movements, usually so efficient, turned extraordinarily delicate as he reached for his tools. The hawk struck out with its beak, but Andrew didn't flinch. "Everything deserves a chance to heal," he muttered, more to himself than to her. His scarred fingers worked with surprising dexterity, snipping the wire strand by strand. The bird made no sound, as if sensing the intent behind the man's actions. Alice found herself drawing closer, fascinated by this display of tenderness from a man the town feared. "Can I help?" she asked softly. Andrew glanced up, seeming startled by her presence. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Hold this cloth. When I lift the last wire, press it gentle-like against the wound." Together they worked to free the hawk. Alice held her breath as Andrew finally removed the last strand, her cloth ready. The bird's wing was raw and bleeding, but nothing seemed broken. Andrew cleaned the wound with careful thoroughness, then wrapped it in strips of clean linen. "It'll need time," he said, fashioning a makeshift cage from an empty crate. "And food. There's dried meat in that jar up there." Alice retrieved the jar, noting how the hawk's eyes followed her movements. Like recognizing like, she thought. Another creature brought to this cabin by circumstance, unsure of its fate. As evening approached, Alice found herself gravitating toward the cooking area. The familiar motions of preparing food settled her nerves, and she had noticed Andrew's sparse pantry. Simple ingredients, but she could work with them. When she set a bowl of hot stew before him, Andrew looked up in surprise. "Much obliged," he said softly, the words rough but sincere. They ate in silence, but it felt less strained than before. The hawk watched from its crate, occasionally shifting its bandaged wing. Alice snuck at bits of meat when she thought Andrew wasn't looking, though she later caught the hint of a smile on his weathered face. Steam rose from their bowls, catching the firelight. Alice studied Andrew's profile, her eyes drawn to the web of scars that marked the left side of his face. They disappeared into his hairline, speaking of some terrible past injury. Before she could stop herself, she asked, "Your scars? Were they from the war?" The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, Andrew set down his spoon. "The war took more than I'll say," he replied, his voice heavy with memory. His hand unconsciously touched his chest, where Alice guessed more scars lay hidden. She didn't press further, recognizing the weight of unspoken grief in his words. Instead, she rose to tend to the hawk, offering it water from a shallow dish. Behind her, she heard Andrew begin to clear the dishes, his movements measured and quiet. Night fell early in the mountains, bringing with it a bitter wind that rattled the cabin's shutters. Alice lay in the bunk, Andrew's bunk, though he'd insisted she take it, listening to the familiar creaks of a building settling. But other sounds made her heart race. The haunting howls of wolves, much closer than she'd ever heard before. Unable to sleep, she turned toward the firelight. Andrew sat in his chair by the hearth, a piece of wood taking shape beneath his knife. His hands moved steadily, each cut precise and purposeful. To her surprise, a soft melody reached her ears. He was humming, the tune familiar from childhood Sunday services. The hymn's gentle notes wove through the night sounds, transforming them from frightening to somehow right, part of the mountain's wild harmony. Alice found herself mouthing the words she'd learned at her mother's knee, words she hadn't spoken since watching that simple casket being lowered into hard prairie soil. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her first prayer in months, "I don't understand your plan, bringing me here, but—" She glanced at Andrew's bowed head, remembering his kindness to the hawk, his quiet grace over meals, his respectful distance. "But perhaps you know better than I." The wind continued its assault on the cabin, but it seemed less threatening now. The wolves' song rose and fell, a wild chorus underneath Andrew's hymn. Alice closed her eyes, the familiar words of prayer settling something deep inside her. She didn't understand this man she'd been forced to marry, with his fearsome reputation and gentle hands, but she was beginning to think there was more to him than the whispers suggested. Near the fire, Andrew's knife continued its steady work, shaping something new from raw wood, just as time and circumstance were slowly reshaping Alice's fears into something closer to curiosity. The hawk shuffled in its crate, settling for the night, another lost creature finding unexpected shelter in this mountain sanctuary. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside, the fire crackled. Andrew hummed his hymn, and Alice drifted toward sleep, her whispered prayers mixing with the ancient songs of the mountain night. A week passed in the mountain cabin, each day falling into a quiet rhythm. The morning sun painted long shadows across the snow-covered ground when the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the silence. Alice looked up from where she was feeding scraps to the recovering hawk, her heart quickening at the unusual noise. Andrew moved to the window, his shoulders tensing as he peered through the frost-etched glass. "United States Marshal," he said quietly, his voice carrying no emotion. "Best you stay inside." Alice nodded, retreating to a spot near the door where she could hear but remain unseen. Through a gap in the rough planks, she watched Andrew step onto the porch, his breath visible in the cold air. The marshal's horse snorted, steam rising from its flanks. Snow crusted the lawman's beard and coat, speaking of a long ride through the winter landscape. He dismounted stiffly, his badge catching the weak sunlight as he straightened. "Marshal Seth Dunning," the rider announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Looking for Andrew Stone." "You found him." Andrew's reply was level, betraying nothing. The marshal's hand rested near his holster, a gesture that seemed both casual and deliberate. "Got word from New Mexico territory. 5 years back, man named Thomas Reeves was found dead outside Santa Fe. Witnesses place you there." Alice's breath caught. She pressed closer to the gap, studying Andrew's face. His expression remained unchanged, but she noticed his hands, always so steady, tighten slightly at his sides. "That's not the truth you think it is," Andrew said quietly. The words hung in the frozen air between the two men. Marshal Dunning's eyes narrowed. "Care to explain that?" "No, sir, not today." Andrew's response was firm, but respectful. "But I reckon if you ride down to Santa Fe, you might find the story ain't what you were told." The marshal studied Andrew for a long moment, snow falling silently around them. "I aim to do just that," he said finally, "and I'll be back, Stone. Count on it." "You'll find me here," Andrew replied, his voice carrying the same quiet certainty that had marked his care of the injured hawk. Alice watched the marshal mount up, his horse's hooves breaking through the crusty snow. He turned in his saddle, fixing Andrew with a hard stare. "Don't make me hunt you down. Won't go well if you run." Andrew stood motionless on the porch until the hoofbeats faded into the distance. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, Alice saw something in his face she hadn't witnessed before, a deep weariness that seemed to age him beyond his years. The day passed in heavy silence. Alice went about her usual tasks, tending the hawk, preparing their simple meal, but her mind churned with questions she dared not ask. As evening approached, she noticed Andrew gathering supplies, dried meat, ammunition, an extra blanket. He was planning to flee. The realization struck her hard. Despite everything, the forced marriage, the fear, the uncertainty, the thought of being left alone in these mountains filled her with a different kind of dread. The cabin, once strange and threatening, had become a kind of sanctuary. And Andrew, for all his fearsome reputation, had shown her nothing but respect. "I'm staying," she said suddenly, her voice stronger than she felt. "No matter what's coming." Andrew turned from his packing, surprise briefly crossing his features. "You don't owe me loyalty," he said, his voice rough. "This marriage wasn't your choice." Alice met his gaze steadily. "Maybe I do," she replied softly. "You haven't raised a hand to me yet." The words held echoes of her past, her father's drunken rages, the men who saw her as property to be claimed. "That counts for something where I come from." Andrew stood very still, his scarred hands resting on the supplies he'd gathered. After a long moment, he began returning items to their shelves, each movement deliberate and final. No more was said about running. They shared their evening meal in silence, but the tension between them had shifted. It was no longer the wariness of strangers forced together, but something heavier, the weight of choices made and consequences approaching. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. Alice watched Andrew from the corner of her eye as she cleared away their bowls. His face was turned toward the flames, deep in thought. The hawk rustled in its crate, wing healing slowly but surely. Like the injured bird, Alice realized, they were all caught in circumstances beyond their control, making the best of what fate, or providence, had dealt them. The fire died gradually, leaving only glowing embers to light the cabin. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of more snow. Alice wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, aware that whatever truth lay in Andrew's past, it would soon come to light. For better or worse, she had chosen to face it beside him. Neither spoke again that night, but something had changed in the space between them. Trust, like the hawk's healing wing, was a fragile thing, but it grew stronger with care and time. As Alice prepared for sleep, she found herself wondering what story the marshal would uncover in Santa Fe, and whether the man she was beginning to know matched the one in those long-ago witnesses' tales. The embers cast a faint red glow across Andrew's features as he sat in his customary chair, still as a statue, waiting for whatever tomorrow might bring. The tension hung thick in the air, heavy as the snow-laden clouds gathering outside their mountain refuge. The days following the marshal's visit brought a relentless sleet that coated the mountain in treacherous ice. Andrew, determined to stockpile wood before the weather worsened, ventured out each morning despite Alice's worried glances. The sound of his axe echoed through the frozen valley, steady as a heartbeat. On the third day, the temperature dropped further. Alice stood at the window, watching Andrew drag timber through the crystalline curtain of sleet. His movements had grown sluggish, lacking their usual precise grace. The hawk in its crate clicked its beak nervously, sensing her unease. When Andrew finally stumbled through the door, his clothes were frozen stiff. Ice clung to his beard, and his face had taken on an alarming gray pallor. He managed 2 steps before his legs gave way. "Andrew!" Alice rushed forward as he collapsed, helping break his fall. His skin burned against hers despite the cold. "You're burning up." He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled with the effort. "Just need to rest," he muttered, but his eyes were glazed and unfocused. Alice's heart raced, but her hands remained steady as she helped him to his bunk. Years of tending to her father's ailments had taught her to act first and worry later. She stripped off his frozen outer layers, replacing them with dry blankets. His breathing came in ragged gasps. "Stay with me," she whispered, more prayer than command. The cabin's stores held dried herbs, and she quickly set water to boil. Her mother had taught her which plants brought down fever before consumption took her. The memory steeled her resolve. As darkness fell, Andrew's fever climbed higher. Alice worked tirelessly, replacing cool cloths on his forehead, coaxing sips of herbal tea between his cracked lips. The hawk watched silently from its crate, yellow eyes gleaming in the firelight. Near midnight, the delirium took hold. Andrew began to mutter, tossing restlessly beneath the blankets. His words came in broken fragments, painting horrific scenes. "Flames! Everywhere flames!" His hands clutched at the blankets. "The children! Get the children out!" Alice pressed a fresh cloth to his forehead, her heart aching at the anguish in his voice. "No, stop them." His words slurred together. "The soldiers, burning everything. Maria!" The name tore from his throat like a wound reopened. A child's cry echoed in his fevered mind, drawing a sob from his chest. "Nina. My Nina. Forgive me." Alice caught his thrashing hand in hers, squeezing gently. "I'm here," she soothed, though she knew he was lost in memories far from their cabin. The night stretched endless, marked by Andrew's delirious pleas and Alice's quiet prayers. She sang hymns softly, the same ones she'd heard him humming, hoping to anchor him to the present. Slowly, as dawn approached, his fever began to break. The first rays of morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows when Andrew's eyes finally opened, clear and aware. He looked at Alice, still holding his hand, and something vulnerable crossed his face. "You stayed," he whispered hoarsely. "Of course I stayed." She helped him sip some water. "You've been burning with fever all night." Andrew's gaze dropped to their joined hands. The morning light revealed the exhaustion etched on Alice's features, the way she swayed slightly from a night without rest. Shame and gratitude warred in his expression. "You were talking," she said softly, "about flames and soldiers." She hesitated. "About Maria and Nina?" His whole body tensed, but he didn't pull away. For several long moments, only the pop of the fire and the hawk's quiet movements broke the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with more than fever. "It was 5 years ago, near Santa Fe." The words came slowly, as if each one cost him dearly. "I was tracking for the army then, after the war. Found an Apache village, peaceful folk who traded with the settlers." He swallowed hard. "Maria was one of them. She taught me their ways, their words, became my wife." Alice's grip on his hand tightened encouragingly. "Nina came a year later." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Tiny thing, with her mama's eyes. The village took me in, made me family." The smile faded. "Then the Confederate raiders came." His free hand fisted in the blanket. "Led by a colonel named Thomas Reeves. They'd been burning settlements all through the territory, claiming to fight for the cause even though the war was long over." Bitterness crept into his voice. "I was away hunting when they attacked. Saw the smoke, rode hard, but—" "Andrew," Alice whispered, her heart breaking for him. "Reeves had them all gathered in the center of the village. Maria was holding Nina, singing to keep her calm." His voice cracked. "I got there just as he gave the order to burn everything, my family included." Tears slid silently down Alice's cheeks as Andrew continued, the words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "I shot him, clean through the heart, but it was too late." His eyes closed against the memory. "I found them, found what was left, in the ashes of our home. I buried them there with Maria's people, been running from it ever since." When he fell silent, Alice reached out with her free hand and gently touched his scarred cheek. "That's what the marshal will find in Santa Fe," she said softly. "The truth of a man defending the innocent against monsters." Andrew's eyes opened, meeting hers. The depth of pain in them stole her breath. "Killing Reeves didn't bring them back, didn't make me any less a failure." "No," Alice agreed quietly. "But it showed what kind of man you are. The same man who tends injured hawks and gives flour to strangers. The same man who's shown nothing but gentleness to a frightened girl forced to be his wife." His breath caught at her words. For a long moment they sat in silence, hands still joined as the morning light grew stronger. Finally, exhaustion overtook him, and his eyes drifted closed. "Rest," Alice murmured, but Andrew was already asleep, his features peaceful for the first time since his collapse. The days that followed took on a different rhythm. As Andrew recovered his strength, Alice divided her time between tending to him and caring for the hawk. The cabin, once a prison of circumstance, began to feel more like a sanctuary. She found herself humming as she worked, and sometimes caught Andrew watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Outside, the relentless winter began to lose its grip. The sound of spring melt trickled beneath the snow, promising change. The hawk's wing was nearly healed, and soon it would be strong enough to fly free. Alice wondered, as she changed Andrew's bandages and brought him soup, if healing could be that simple for human hearts as well. Proper care, time, and the courage to trust again. In quiet moments, she found herself studying his face, seeing beyond the scars to the man beneath. The man who prayed over his meals and helped strangers. The man who had loved so deeply that loss had driven him into the mountains. The man who, despite everything, still showed kindness to every creature that crossed his path. The ice continued to melt, drop by drop, like the walls between them. The late winter sun cast long shadows across the snow as Andrew's strength slowly returned. Alice had just finished hanging fresh herbs to dry when hoofbeats thundered up the path to their cabin. Andrew reached for his rifle, but Alice touched his arm, pointing to the familiar figure approaching. "That's Mrs. Clara Hanley," she said. recognizing the widow from town. The woman's normally neat appearance was disheveled, her dark hair escaping its pins as she rode hard through the slush. Andrew lowered his weapon as Mrs. Hanley dismounted, stumbling in her haste. Her eyes were red from crying, and her young son Timothy clung to her skirts, no more than 6 years old. "Please," she gasped. "I didn't know where else to turn. The thaw—" She caught her breath. "The roof of our house. It couldn't take the weight of the melting snow. Half of it's caved in." Alice hurried to steady the distraught woman while Andrew studied the position of the sun. "How bad's the damage?" he asked quietly. "Bad enough that we can't sleep there," Mrs. Hanley replied, wiping her eyes with trembling hands. "Everything's exposed to the elements. I've got some boards, but I can't manage the repairs alone, and none of the men in town would—" She broke off, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Alice knew why. Clara Hanley had refused several marriage proposals after her husband's death, determined to maintain her independence. The town hadn't taken kindly to her decision. Andrew was already pulling on his coat. "We'll need tools," he said simply. "Alice, can you gather some food and blankets? Might be a long day's work." Relief flooded Mrs. Hanley's face. "I can pay—" "No need," Andrew cut her off, his tone gentle but firm. He turned to the boy, who had been watching him with wide, fearful eyes. Andrew knelt down to Timothy's level, his movements slow and careful. "Your pa was a carpenter, wasn't he, son?" Timothy nodded, clutching his mother's skirts a little less tightly. "Then maybe you can help me with the roof," Andrew said. "A carpenter's boy would know good wood from bad." A tiny smile crept across Timothy's face. "Pa taught me about grain patterns," he whispered. "That's exactly what we'll need to know." Andrew stood, gathering his tools. "We'll take the wagon, more stable in the mud." Within the hour, they were bouncing along the rough track to the Hanley homestead. Alice sat in the back with Mrs. Hanley and Timothy, while Andrew handled the reins. The boy had warmed up enough to pepper Andrew with questions about different types of wood, which Andrew answered with unexpected patience. The damage was indeed severe when they arrived. One entire section of the roof had buckled under the weight of melting snow, leaving the kitchen and bedroom exposed to the elements. Andrew surveyed the scene with a critical eye, while Alice helped Mrs. Hanley salvage what they could from the wet rooms. "We've got enough spare boards," Andrew announced. "Timothy, want to help me check which ones are best?" The boy practically bounced over to assist, his earlier fear forgotten. Andrew showed him how to check each board's strength and grain, praising his careful choices. Alice watched them work together, something warm unfurling in her chest at the sight of Andrew's gentleness with the child. They worked through the day, Andrew directing the repairs, while Timothy handed him nails and tools. The women prepared a simple meal of bread and stew, and Alice noticed how Mrs. Hanley's hands had steadied, her faith in humanity somewhat restored by their help. As the sun began to set, Andrew secured the last board in place. The repair wasn't pretty, but it was solid. "It'll hold," he assured Mrs. Hanley. "Might want to add some tar paper when you can get it, but you'll stay dry." "I don't know how to thank you," Mrs. Hanley said, her voice thick with gratitude. "No need," Andrew repeated, but his eyes were kind. "Timothy here did half the work." The boy beamed with pride, clutching a small piece of wood Andrew had shown him how to smooth. As they prepared to leave, Timothy ran up to Andrew, wrapping his arms around the tall man's legs in a quick hug before darting back to his mother. They were halfway home, the wagon creaking through the gathering dusk, when Alice spotted something dark against the snow. "Andrew, stop!" she called out. "There's something by that fallen pine." Andrew pulled the wagon to a halt, squinting through the dimming light. A small figure lay curled at the base of the tree, barely visible in the shadows. He was off the wagon in an instant, approaching carefully. "It's a child," he called back, his voice tight with concern. "Ute, by his clothes. He's breathing, but barely." Alice scrambled down to help as Andrew gathered the boy in his arms. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his skin burning with fever despite his half-frozen state. His clothes were traditional Ute garments, but he wore them alone, with no sign of family nearby. "There was sickness in the Ute camps," Andrew said grimly, carrying the boy to the wagon. "I heard talk of it in town. Some bands were forced to leave their weak behind when game grew scarce." "We can't leave him," Alice said, though she knew Andrew had no intention of doing so. "No, we can't." Andrew wrapped the child in their spare blankets. "I know where his people usually winter. When he's stronger, we'll find them." The boy didn't stir during the ride home, but his breathing remained steady. Once in the cabin, Alice helped Andrew remove the child's wet clothes while water heated on the stove. They worked in comfortable tandem, Andrew mixing herbs he said would help with fever, while Alice prepared a thin broth. When the boy finally opened his eyes, Andrew spoke to him softly in halting Ute language. The child's fear visibly eased at the familiar words, though he was still too weak to respond. Andrew helped him sit up enough to sip the warm broth, murmuring what sounded like a prayer between spoonfuls. Alice tended to the hawk as she watched them, struck by the tenderness in Andrew's scarred hands as he cared for the sick child. The same hands that could set a trap or wield a rifle were capable of such gentle comfort. Later, when the boy had fallen into a more peaceful sleep, Alice sat beside Andrew near the fire. "The prayer you said," she ventured quietly. "You learned that from your wife?" Andrew nodded, his eyes on the flames. "Maria taught me their ways, their prayers. Said you couldn't truly know a people without knowing how they spoke to Creator." A small smile touched his lips. She'd be glad to see it helping another child. Alice reached over and squeezed his hand. He returned the pressure, and they sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled. Outside, snow still blanketed the world, but inside their cabin, warmth and hope glowed like a beacon in the night. The hawk rustled in its crate. The Ute boy breathed steadily from his borrowed blankets, and in that moment, their small cabin felt less like a place of exile and more like a sanctuary for healing souls. The mountain snow had finally surrendered to spring's warmth, leaving muddy trails and swollen streams in the valley below. Fresh green buds dotted the aspens around their cabin, and birdsong filled the morning air. Alice stood at the wash basin, smoothing her best dress, faded blue cotton saved for special occasions. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned up her hair. "We don't have to go," Andrew said from his corner, watching her preparation with obvious discomfort. He hadn't worn his good shirt in months, and it sat stiffly across his shoulders. "Yes, we do," Alice replied gently. "Preacher Morrison invited everyone. We're part of everyone now." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He'd been different since they'd returned the Ute boy to his people 2 weeks ago. Quieter, more thoughtful. The child's grandfather had clasped Andrew's hand in both of his, speaking words that made Andrew's eyes shine with unshed tears. Since then, he'd taken to reading his Bible in the evenings, though he never spoke of what he read. The wagon creaked as they loaded it with sweet rolls Alice had baked for the after-service gathering. Andrew checked the wheels and harnesses 3 times before helping her up to the seat. His movements were precise, controlled, betraying his nervousness. "They'll stare," he said flatly as they started down the mountain track. "Let them," Alice answered, smoothing her skirts. "They don't know you like I do." The ride down took nearly 2 hours, the wagon jolting over half-frozen ruts. Spring clouds scudded across the sky, threatening rain. Alice watched Andrew's hands grip the reins too tightly, his knuckles white. When they passed other wagons heading to town, he kept his eyes fixed forward, ignoring the curious glances. The mission church sat on the outskirts of town, its weathered white boards gleaming in the weak sunlight. Wagons and horses crowded the yard, and the sound of voices carried through the open windows. Andrew's shoulders tensed as he helped Alice down, conscious of the sudden hush that fell over the gathering crowd. "Morning, folks," Preacher Morrison called out, deliberately striding over to them. He was a slight man with kind eyes and iron-gray hair. "Glad you could make it. Alice, those must be your sweet rolls I smell." "Yes, sir," she replied, grateful for his welcome. "Made with the last of our winter honey." "Wonderful. Mrs. Morrison will show you where to set them. Andrew, there's space in the back pews if you'd prefer." Andrew nodded stiffly, following Alice into the church. The wooden floors creaked under their boots as they made their way to a rear bench. Alice noticed how he positioned himself at the end, keeping his scarred side away from the aisle. Her heart ached at his careful dignity. More settlers filed in, filling the church with the rustle of Sunday clothes and muffled coughs. Alice recognized Mrs. Hanley and Timothy seated a few rows ahead. The boy turned and waved, earning a small nod from Andrew. Preacher Morrison took his place at the front, and the service began. Andrew stood when others stood, sat when they sat, but remained silent through the first prayers. His hat brim was crumpled between his fingers, his eyes fixed on some distant point. When the first hymn began, he stayed mute beside her. Alice opened her hymnal, finding Amazing Grace on the worn pages. She started singing softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." She felt Andrew's slight start beside her. His breathing changed, grew uneven. By the second verse, his deep voice joined hers, rough with disuse but true. "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved." Something shifted in the air around them. Other voices faltered briefly, then swelled stronger. The harmony rose to the rafters, carrying with it years of dust and silence from Andrew's soul. Alice saw a tear track down his cheek, but he sang on, steady and clear. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come." The preacher's sermon that day spoke of spring's renewal, of hope rising from winter's grave. Alice barely heard it, too aware of Andrew beside her, his presence both stronger and gentler than before. He had tucked his hat under the pew, and his hands lay open on his knees. When the service ended, people began filing out into the yard, where tables had been set up for the meal. Andrew started to turn toward the wagon, but Preacher Morrison's voice stopped him. "Mr. Stone," he called, walking down the aisle. The remaining congregants paused, watching. The preacher extended his hand, weathered palm up in welcome. "The Lord works strange mercies, doesn't he? Welcome home, son." Andrew stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and clasped it. "Thank you, preacher," he said, his voice rough but clear. The tension in the church broke like ice in spring. Mrs. Hanley stepped forward to thank him again for fixing her roof. Others followed, nodding greeting or offering cautious smiles. Timothy darted over to show Andrew a wooden horse he'd carved, using the techniques Andrew had taught him. Alice stood back, watching as years of isolation cracked and fell away. Andrew's responses were still quiet, still careful, but something had eased in his bearing. When Mrs. Morrison insisted they stay for dinner, he didn't refuse. The ride home was different. Andrew sat straighter in the wagon seat, his grip on the reins relaxed. As they climbed back into the mountains, the first smile Alice had ever seen touched his lips. Faint, but real, "Thank you," he said softly, "for making me go." "You were ready," she replied. "You just needed a reminder that grace finds us all." The sun was lowering when they reached the cabin, painting the snowmelt streams in gold. Instead of heading inside, Andrew walked to the back of the cabin where the soil had begun to soften. He studied the ground thoughtfully. "Might be time to plant those early beans," he said. "Ground's nearly warm enough." Alice joined him, testing the earth with her fingers. "It feels ready. I saw wild bees earlier, working the first flowers." "Bees?" Andrew nodded slowly. "We could keep them, come summer. Build some hives here where it's sheltered. Have our own honey next winter." "I'd like that," Alice said, understanding what he wasn't saying, that he was planning for their future, seeing beyond the next day or week, that he was choosing to put down roots, literal and figurative. Together they worked the soil, marking rows for the beans while the evening light faded. Each pressed seed was a small act of faith, a belief in tomorrow's harvest. When they finally went inside, the cabin felt different. No longer a place of exile, but a home being built choice by choice, prayer by prayer. The hymn lingered in Alice's mind as she prepared their supper. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come." She watched Andrew kindle the fire, his movements peaceful in the gathering dark. Grace had brought them here, to this quiet moment of belonging. Like the beans they'd planted, something new was taking root. The mountain spring unfolded like a flower, one petal at a time. Mornings dawned clear and cool, warming steadily as the sun climbed over the peaks. Alice found herself settling into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Each day brought its own small gifts. Tender shoots breaking through the garden soil, wild strawberries ripening in hidden patches, the strengthening wing beats of their healing hawk. The garden flourished under her care. Alice spent hours there, working the rich earth between the neat rows of beans and peas. She had planted herbs, too, thyme and sage that reminded her of her mother's garden from long ago. Andrew had built her a proper fence to keep the deer away. They see how clean split rails testament to his careful work. "You've got a way with growing things," Andrew said one morning, watching her thin the seedlings. His voice carried a warmth that still surprised her sometimes. "They just need patience," she replied, brushing dirt from her apron. "Like most living things." The Ute boy, who they called Little Fox after his quick, bright eyes, helped her water the rows each evening. He was recovering his strength, though his tribe's winter camp had already moved on. Andrew spent hours teaching him, first in simple English, then adding scripture stories that Little Fox soaked up like rain. "Creator God made all things," Little Fox would practice carefully, pointing to sky and earth as Andrew had shown him. His pronunciation grew clearer each day, though he still mixed Ute words with English in endearing ways. Alice often paused in her work to watch them. Andrew sitting on the chopping block, Little Fox cross-legged at his feet, both bent over the worn Bible Andrew handled like something precious. The sight tugged at her heart in ways she wasn't ready to name. One bright morning in late spring, Andrew rode up from his fence-mending rounds with a letter in his hand. Alice's stomach tightened at the sight of the official envelope, but Andrew's expression stayed calm as he read. "From Marshal Dunning," he said finally, folding the paper carefully. "The investigation's still open, but there's no warrant yet. He's having trouble finding witnesses from that far back." Alice let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That's good news?" Andrew nodded slowly. "Better than we might have hoped, though it's not finished." He tucked the letter away and went to unsaddle his horse, moving with his usual deliberate care. That evening, after the supper dishes were cleared, Alice took out the journal she'd started keeping. It was a simple notebook, its pages already filling with her careful script. She wrote about the letter, about the mix of relief and lingering worry. But mostly she wrote about their days, the hawks' strengthening flights around the cabin, Little Fox's growing vocabulary, the way Andrew's shoulders had begun to lose their defensive hunch. "The hawk took fish from Andrew's hand today," she wrote. "Its wing has healed clean, though it chooses to stay near. Perhaps it knows it's safe here. We've all found shelter of a sort." A rumble of thunder interrupted her writing. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon was rolling in from the west, bringing with it the sharp smell of rain. Little Fox, already tucked into his pallet by the fire, sat up with wide eyes at the next boom. "Just thunder, little one," Andrew said quietly in Ute, the words still awkward on his tongue. "Creator God's voice in the clouds." Alice closed her journal as the first heavy drops struck the roof. The cabin suddenly felt very small and safe against the growing storm. Andrew lit the lamp and picked up his Bible, its leather cover smooth from years of handling. "Would you read?" she asked, settling into her chair by the fire. "It might help Little Fox sleep through the noise." Andrew opened to the Psalms, his finger finding a familiar place. His deep voice filled the cabin, steady under the thunder. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The old words washed over them like the rain outside. Little Fox's breathing slowly steadied into sleep. Alice felt her own eyes growing heavy, lulled by Andrew's voice and the drumming on the roof. The last thing she remembered was the warm flicker of firelight on the cabin walls. She woke to pale dawn light filtering through the windows. Someone, Andrew, had draped a blanket over her in the chair. The storm had passed, leaving everything fresh and clean. Little Fox still slept soundly, curled in his blankets. A movement caught her eye. The hawk was perched on the windowsill, its feathers gleaming in the morning sun. As she watched, it turned its head to regard her with one bright eye. Then, with a single powerful beat of its healed wings, it launched itself into the sky. Alice went to the window, watching the hawk soar over the valley. Its flight was strong and sure, no trace remaining of its former injury. Yet instead of disappearing over the mountains, it wheeled in a wide circle and returned to land in a nearby pine. "It's staying close still," Andrew said quietly behind her. She hadn't heard him come in from his morning chores. "Yes," she replied, understanding in her bones why the hawk lingered. "Sometimes healing means finding where you belong." Andrew's hand touched her shoulder briefly, a gesture as light as a bird landing, but full of meaning. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of storm clouds. The garden sparkled with raindrops, each one catching the light like a promise. Little Fox stirred on his pallet, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Thunder gone?" he asked in his mixed language. "All gone," Alice assured him. "Come help me check if the rain helped our seeds grow." The boy scrambled up eagerly. As they headed out to the garden, Alice glanced back to see Andrew watching them, a look of quiet contentment on his weathered face. The hawk called from its pine perch, a wild, free sound that echoed off the mountains. Alice touched the smooth pages of her journal, tucked safely in her apron pocket. Later she would write about this morning. The fresh-washed air, the hawk's flight, the way peace felt like something you could hold in your hands if you were careful enough. For now, though, she had seeds to tend and a day's worth of small joys to gather. The morning opened before them like a book waiting to be written, each hour a blank page full of possibility. Above, the hawk rode the warming thermals, keeping watch over its chosen home. The summer heat pressed down on the valley like a heavy blanket. Alice wiped sweat from her brow as she hung sheets on the line behind the cabin. The cotton snapped in the warm breeze, bright white against the deep blue sky. Little Fox helped her, carefully passing clothespins up from the basket while humming a tune Andrew had taught him. The distant rumble of wheels made them both pause. Alice shaded her eyes, peering down the winding mountain road. A cloud of dust marked the approach of what looked like a stagecoach, unusual for these remote parts. Behind her, she heard the cabin door open as Andrew stepped out, his boots creaking on the wooden porch. "Visitors," he said quietly, moving to stand beside her. Something in his tone made her glance up at his face. His jaw had tightened, eyes narrowed against the glare. The stagecoach drew closer, its polished wood gleaming in the afternoon sun. 4 well-groomed horses pulled it along, far finer than the usual mountain transport. Behind it rode 3 men on horseback, their suits marking them as city folk despite the trail dust coating them. Alice's heart nearly stopped when she recognized the man sitting beside the driver. Even at this distance, she would know that posture anywhere. The cocky tilt of the head, the too straight back that spoke of practiced charm rather than natural dignity. "Father," she whispered, her fingers clutching the damp sheet she still held. Little Fox pressed against her skirts, suddenly shy. Andrew's hand found her shoulder, steady and warm. "Go inside with the boy," he said softly. "No need to face this if you don't want to." But Alice shook her head. "No, I won't hide." She'd done enough hiding in her life. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in the yard, wheels crunching on gravel. Jacob Trenton stepped down first, brushing dust from his fine wool coat with manicured hands. He looked prosperous. Too prosperous for a man she'd last seen drunk and desperate in a saloon. "Well now," he called out, all honey and smoke in his voice. "If it isn't my dear daughter and her mountain man." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Quite the domestic scene you've made up here?" The other men dismounted, their expensive boots unsuited for the rocky ground. One carried a leather portfolio stuffed with papers. They moved with the entitled confidence of men used to getting their way. "What brings you so far from your usual haunts, Mr. Trenton?" Andrew's voice carried across the yard, level and controlled. "Business, my good man. Railroad business." Jacob gestured to his companions. "These fine gentlemen represent the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Seems there's been quite a discovery in these hills. Silver, and plenty of it." He pulled out a cheroot and lit it with practiced flair. "Right under your feet, as it happens." The man with the portfolio stepped forward, extracting several official-looking documents. "We've come to discuss mineral rights and land claims, Mr. Stone. The company is prepared to make a very generous offer." Andrew's hand tightened slightly on Alice's shoulder. "This land isn't for sale. It's protected by treaty." Jacob's pleasant mask slipped for just a moment. "Ah, yes, the famous treaty. The one you got through your previous arrangement." He blew smoke toward them. "But correct me if I'm wrong. That poor Apache woman is dead now, isn't she? Along with any claim she might have had." Alice felt Andrew go very still beside her. The air seemed to crackle with tension. "That ground's my wife's by treaty," Andrew said, each word carved from stone. "Alice's land now, legal and proper." "Legal?" Jacob barked out a laugh. "A forced marriage in a saloon, witnessed by drunks, and to a man wanted for murder?" He turned to Alice, voice dripping false concern. "Did you know that about your husband, daughter? Did he tell you what he did?" "I know everything I need to know," Alice said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "Please leave, Father. You're not welcome here." Jacob's face darkened. "You chose a murderer over your own blood? That's the thanks I get for trying to save you from this wilderness?" He spat into the dust. The railroad's coming, whether you like it or not. Treaties die with their holders. Everybody knows that. Be smart about this, both of you." The men behind him shifted, hands drifting toward coat pockets in a way that made Alice's blood run cold. But Andrew didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stood, solid as the mountains themselves. "I think you'd best ride on," he said quietly, "while you still can." Something in his tone made even Jacob step back. The railroad men exchanged glances, their confidence wavering. "This isn't over," Jacob snarled, but he was already turning away. "We'll be back with papers you can't ignore. Come on, gentlemen." They mounted up quickly, the stagecoach turning in a wide circle that tore up Alice's carefully tended yard. She watched them go, vision blurring, until they were nothing but a dust cloud on the horizon. Only then did her legs give way. Andrew caught her before she could fall, gathering her close as the tears finally came. Little Fox pressed against them both, his small hands patting her arm in confused comfort. "I'm sorry," she sobbed into Andrew's shirt. "I'm so sorry he came here. That he threatened. That he said those things." "Hush now," Andrew murmured. "You've nothing to be sorry for. The sins of fathers aren't carried by their children." He led her gently to the porch, settling her in the old rocking chair. Little Fox ran to fetch her a cup of water, his face pinched with worry. "What will we do?" she asked when she could speak again. "They'll come back. The railroad always gets what it wants." Andrew knelt beside her chair, his scarred face grave but calm. "We'll do what's right. Nothing more or less." He took her trembling hands in his. "I won't fight unless forced. There's been enough blood spilled over land in these mountains." The sun was setting now, painting the valley in deep, gold and purple shadows. Little Fox helped Andrew with the evening chores, while Alice tried to steady herself by finishing the laundry. But her father's words kept echoing in her head, poisoning the peace they'd built here. After supper, when Little Fox was asleep in his pallet, Alice couldn't rest. She stood in the cabin doorway, watching the stars emerge one by one. Behind her, she heard the soft creak of floorboards. Andrew had knelt by the hearth, his head bowed in prayer. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair, the deep lines around his eyes. His lips moved silently for a long time before she caught the whispered words, "Lord, give me strength, not to fight, but to stand firm. Not to kill, but to protect. Let me find another way." Alice's throat tightened. This was the man her father had called murderer. This gentle soul who taught scripture to an orphaned boy, who nursed wounded hawks, who prayed for peace even in the face of threats. She closed the door softly and went to kneel beside him. After a moment, she felt his hand cover hers, warm and calloused. Together they prayed in silence while the mountain night deepened around their little cabin, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out its lonely song to the stars. The morning after Jacob Trenton's visit brought no peace to the mountain valley. Alice stood at the cabin window, watching men in crisp suits march across their land with measuring chains and wooden stakes. Their boots crushed the tender bean sprouts she'd planted with such hope just weeks ago. "Marking their claim," Andrew said quietly behind her. "Railroad's always been good at taking what they want." Little Fox pressed his face against the glass, dark eyes tracking the stranger's movements. "Bad men," he muttered in English, one of the first phrases Andrew had taught him. Alice's hands twisted in her apron. "They're putting up notices all along the fence line. I can see the red stamps from here." Andrew pulled on his coat, worn leather creaking at the shoulders. "I'm riding to the mission. Preacher Matthews kept records from when this was agency land. Might be the original deed still in his files." "Let me come with you," Alice said, but Andrew shook his head. Best you stay. Mrs. Hanley sent word. She's scared they'll come for her place next. She could use a friend today." Alice nodded, understanding. Clara Hanley had lost enough already. She shouldn't face this alone. Andrew saddled his horse, careful to give the railroad men wide berth as he rode out. They watched him go with calculating eyes, already measuring the valley for train tracks and silver mines. Alice found Mrs. Hanley in her kitchen, hands shaking as she tried to pour coffee. Her young son Tommy played with wooden blocks in the corner, unaware of the fear in his mother's face. "They came at dawn," Clara whispered, sinking into a chair. "Said the whole valley's been surveyed for the railroad, that we're all squatting on company land now." She pressed trembling fingers to her lips. "Where will we go? Tommy's father is buried here." Alice gripped her friend's shoulder. "Andrew's gone to find proof, old deeds from the agency. We won't let them drive us out." "But the railroad's so powerful," Clara's voice cracked. "And your father, forgive me for saying it, he seems the type to burn what he can't buy." Alice couldn't argue. She'd seen that ruthless glint in Jacob's eyes too many times before. They spent the afternoon putting up preserves, trying to keep their hands busy while watching surveyors tramp across Clara's wheat field. Tommy asked why the men were putting sticks in his papa's garden. Neither woman had the heart to answer. The sun was setting when Alice heard hoofbeats approaching her cabin. She bid Clara goodbye and hurried home, only to stop short at the sight of Andrew dismounting stiffly, blood staining his shirt collar. "What happened?" She rushed to help him with the saddle. His movements were careful, pained. "Ran into some surveyors near Miller's Creek. They didn't take kindly to questions about their authority." Andrew's voice was flat. "Threw the first punch when I mentioned treaty rights." Inside, she made him sit while she cleaned a cut above his eye. His knuckles were raw, but she noticed he hadn't drawn his knife or gun. The old Andrew Stone might have killed men for less. "Did you find anything at the mission?" she asked, pressing a cold cloth to his temple. "Preacher Matthews thinks he knows where the original papers are. Says he'll look through the old agency files tonight." Andrew caught her wrist gently. "Those men wanted me to fight back harder. Wanted an excuse to claim I'm still violent." "But you didn't give them one." "No." His eyes were distant, troubled. "If I start fighting again, I'll never stop. Seen too many men lose themselves that way." He touched the scar on his cheek. "Lost myself once already." Little Fox brought them bowls of beans and cornbread, but nobody had much appetite. They ate in heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of the hearth fire. Outside, coyotes yipped in the gathering dark, as if laughing at their predicament. Alice tried to sleep but found herself tossing in the strange midnight quiet. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with flame and smoke. She saw the valley burning, railroad men pouring kerosene on fences while Jacob Trenton watched with that same cold smile he'd worn in the saloon. She heard children crying, Tommy Hanley, Little Fox, and another child she'd never seen, all calling out in different languages as fire consumed everything they loved. She woke with a gasp, heart pounding. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. Andrew sat beside them, still as stone, staring into the fading glow. His face in the red light reminded her of how he'd looked that first night in the saloon. Haunted, dangerous, a man carrying too many ghosts. But then he turned to her, and she saw something else in his eyes. Not violence, not revenge, just bone-deep weariness and an aching sort of grace. "Bad dreams?" he asked softly. She nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter. "I saw the valley burning. Seems we're sharing nights again." He poked at the embers with a stick. "I keep seeing that Apache village, wondering if I could have saved them without killing, If there was another way, I was too angry to see. Alice moved to sit beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder. You did what you thought was right. Maybe, but right and righteous aren't always the same thing. He was quiet for a long moment. I won't let violence solve this. Won't give them reason to call me murderer again. There has to be another path. We'll find it, Alice said, and was surprised to realize she believed it. Together. They sat in companionable silence, watching the last embers fade to ash while the mountain night pressed close around their cabin. Little Fox murmured in his sleep, mixing Ute and English words in his dreams. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out its lonely question to the stars. Dawn would bring more surveyors, more threats, more hard choices. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and morning, Alice felt a strange sort of peace. She looked at Andrew's profile, at the man who'd chosen mercy over vengeance, and knew they would face whatever came with the same quiet strength that had brought them this far. The fire died completely, leaving only the ghost of warmth in the hearth. Neither of them moved to rebuild it. Sometimes, Alice was learning, the hardest battles were won not with flame and fury, but with the patient endurance of hearts that refused to burn. The morning dew still clung to the grass when hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Alice looked up from hanging laundry, her heart skipping as Marshal Dunning's familiar silhouette appeared against the brightening sky. Behind him rode 2 deputies, their badges catching the early light. Andrew stepped out of the cabin, wiping his hands on a cloth. He'd been helping Little Fox with his letters, chalk dust still marking his sleeves. His expression hardened as the lawmen approached. "Mr. Stone," Marshal Dunning called out, his voice carrying no warmth. "Got some business to attend to." Alice moved closer to Andrew, feeling the tension ripple through the morning air. The deputy's hands rested too casually on their holsters. "Thought we settled this, Marshal," Andrew said quietly. "Preacher Matthews found the papers. This ain't about land claims." Dunning dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. "Got orders to bring you in on that old murder charge from New Mexico territory." "What?" Alice stepped forward. "But you said the investigation. Railroad company lawyers got involved." The marshal wouldn't meet her eyes. "They're pushing to clear up any complications before laying track." Andrew's jaw tightened. "You mean my father-in-law's pulling strings?" "Just doing my job, Stone." Dunning pulled iron shackles from his saddlebag. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Little Fox appeared in the doorway, eyes wide with fear. Andrew turned to him, speaking soft words in Ute that made the boy nod and retreat inside. When he faced the marshal again, his voice was steady. "Let me get my coat." "Andrew, no!" Alice rushed to the cabin and grabbed the letter they'd received yesterday. "Marshal, please, look at this. Preacher Matthews found references to the original treaty. It proves Andrew was defending his family's land." Rain began to fall, fat drops spattering the paper she held out. Dunning barely glanced at it. "Court can sort that out. For now, I've got orders." He stepped forward with the shackles. "Hands out, Stone." Andrew complied without resistance, though Alice saw him wince as the cold iron bit into his wrists. The sound of the locks clicking shut seemed to echo across the yard. "I'll ready a horse," she said, turning toward the barn, but Dunning shook his head. "He'll ride with us. You can follow if you want, but he stays in our custody." The rain fell harder as they led Andrew to a spare mount. He looked back once at the cabin, at Little Fox watching through the window, at the garden they'd planted together. His eyes met Alice's, and she saw not defeat, but a quiet resolve that steadied her racing heart. "I'll be right behind you," she promised. The journey to town stretched long through the wet afternoon. Alice rode several yards behind the lawman, watching Andrew's back grow increasingly sodden as the rain soaked through his coat. Her own clothes clung cold against her skin, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Her mind raced with prayers and plans and fears she couldn't quite suppress. They passed Mrs. Hanley's homestead. Clara stood in her doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth as she watched the procession. Tommy peeked around her skirts, confusion clear on his young face. Alice managed a small wave, trying to convey reassurance she didn't feel. The town appeared through the rain like a smudged watercolor, buildings bleeding gray into the wet afternoon. People stopped to stare as the group rode down the muddy main street. Alice heard their whispers, saw fingers point and heads shake. The same townsfolk who'd begun to accept Andrew at church now turned away, as if his supposed guilt might somehow stain them. Movement caught her eye, Jacob Trenton watching from the saloon window, a satisfied smirk visible even through the rain-streaked glass. He raised his whiskey glass in mock salute. Alice urged her horse forward, refusing to acknowledge him. The jail squatted at the edge of town, a squat building of weathered boards and iron bars. Alice dismounted as the deputies led Andrew inside, her boots splashing in the puddles gathering on the wooden sidewalk. She tried to follow, but Dunning blocked the door. "Visiting hours are over, Mrs. Stone. Come back tomorrow." "Please," she said. "Just let me make sure he's settled." The marshal's weathered face softened slightly. 5 minutes, that's all I can give you." Inside, the jail smelled of damp wood and old sweat. Andrew stood in a narrow cell while a deputy removed his shackles through the bars. His clothes dripped steadily onto the plank floor. "I'll bring dry things tomorrow," Alice said, pressing close to the iron bars. "And food. The preacher will help us find a lawyer." "Alice." Andrew's voice was gentle but firm. "Don't wear yourself out fighting this. Sometimes we have to trust God's timing, even when we can't see his purpose." She wanted to argue, to rail against the injustice, but something in his calm acceptance stopped her. This was the man who'd learned to choose peace over vengeance, who'd found grace in his darkest moments. "I won't give up," she whispered. "I know." He reached through the bars to touch her cheek, his fingers cold from the rain. "That's why I love you." The words hung in the damp air between them, the first time he'd said them aloud. Before Alice could respond, Dunning cleared his throat. "Time's up, Mrs. Stone." She backed away reluctantly, holding Andrew's gaze until she reached the door. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, though heavy clouds still hung low over the town. Alice stood for a moment in the gathering dusk, watching lanterns flicker to life in windows up and down the street. Music drifted from the saloon where her father celebrated his victory. Somewhere a dog barked, and a woman called children in for supper. The ordinary sounds of evening seemed suddenly hollow, wrong. Her feet carried her to the small church at the end of the street. The door creaked as she entered, her footsteps echoing in the empty sanctuary. A few candles still burned near the altar, their flames reflecting off the rain-washed windows like distant stars. Alice sank onto a hard wooden pew, her wet clothes leaving dark patches on the worn surface. The silence wrapped around her like a heavy blanket as she stared at the rough-hewn cross on the wall. "I'm not asking for a miracle," she whispered into the quiet. "I'm not even asking for his freedom, though you know how much I want it." Her voice caught. "Just give him peace. Let him feel your presence in that cell the way he did in our cabin. Don't let this break his spirit when he's only just found it again." The candles flickered, as if in response, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Alice remembered Andrew's face in the firelight, reading psalms during the storm, his gentle hands tending the wounded hawk, his voice joining hers in hymns that Sunday morning when he'd first dared to worship in public. "And give me strength," she added softly, "not to fight. He's teaching me there are better ways than fighting, but to stand firm, to keep faith, to be the kind of wife who honors the good man he's become, not the killer everyone claims he is." A floorboard creaked behind her. Alice turned to find Preacher Matthews in the doorway, his kind face grave in the candlelight. "I heard about Andrew," he said. "I've sent word to a lawyer friend in Denver who handles Indian affairs. He might be able to help." "Thank you." Alice wiped her eyes. "I should go. Little Fox will be worried, and I need to arrange care for him while—" Her voice broke again. The preacher stepped forward, laying a weathered hand on her shoulder. "The Lord hasn't brought Andrew this far to abandon him now, or you." He smiled gently. "You're both welcome to stay here and pray as long as you need." Alice nodded gratefully, but stood anyway. There would be time for more prayers tomorrow. Tonight, a frightened boy waited for news of the only father figure he had left. Tonight, she needed to be strong for others, just as Andrew had taught her. She paused in the church doorway, looking back at the steadily burning candles. Their light seemed somehow brighter now, more purposeful, like hope taking physical form in the darkness. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same quiet courage she'd learned from the man everyone else had feared. The evening air felt cooler now, cleansed by the rain. Alice drew her damp shawl closer and started the long walk to where she'd tied her horse. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight she carried with her the peace she'd prayed for, not just for Andrew, but for her own anxious heart. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in pale gold as Preacher Matthews's wagon rattled up to the courthouse. Alice, who had been pacing the boardwalk since sunrise, rushed to meet him. His weather-worn face broke into a smile as he pulled a leather folder from beneath his coat. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, climbing down from the wagon seat. "Found this buried in a trunk of mission records. The deed was registered under her Apache name, Standing Willow. The territory grant is ironclad." Alice's hands trembled as she opened the folder. The yellowed paper inside bore official seals and flowing script, recording the land grant to Standing Willow, wife of Andrew Stone. Her heart leaped at this tangible proof of Andrew's truth. "We need to show this to the judge right away," she said, clutching the document to her chest. People were already filing into the courthouse for the morning session. Alice smoothed her skirts, touched the cross at her throat, and followed the preacher inside. The wooden gallery creaked under the weight of curious townsfolk who had come to watch. She saw Mrs. Hanley and Tommy slip into a back row, and Clara gave her an encouraging nod. Judge Harrison sat behind his broad desk, spectacles perched on his nose as he shuffled through papers. Marshal Dunning stood nearby, his face unreadable. In the corner, Jacob Trenton lounged with his railroad associates, looking supremely confident. "Your Honor," Preacher Matthews called out, his voice carrying through the crowded room. "We have evidence pertinent to the Stone case." The judge peered over his glasses. "Approach." Alice's legs felt weak as she walked forward, but she forced herself to stand straight. The preacher's steady presence beside her gave her courage. She unfolded the deed with careful fingers. "This document proves Andrew Stone's legal claim to the disputed land," she said, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "It was granted to his first wife, Standing Willow, by territorial authorities. The grant remains valid even after her death." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge examined the deed closely, comparing seals and signatures. "This appears authentic," he said slowly. "Marshal Dunning, your thoughts?" The marshal stepped forward to study the document. "I recognize that seal, Your Honor. It's genuine." "No!" Jacob Trenton's shout cut through the whispers. He surged to his feet, face mottled with rage. "That paper's worthless. The land belongs to Progress now." "The law says otherwise," the judge replied firmly. Alice saw the movement too late, her father's hand dropping to his gun belt, the flash of steel as he drew his revolver. She barely had time to gasp before Andrew, who had been led in for the hearing, broke free from his guards and lunged forward. The shot cracked through the courthouse. Andrew grunted as the bullet grazed his shoulder, blood darkening his shirt sleeve. But he remained standing between Alice and the gun, his body a shield. "Drop it, Trenton!" Marshal Dunning's voice rang with authority as he leveled his own weapon. "You're under arrest." Deputies swarmed forward to disarm and restrain the gambler, who continued shouting threats as they dragged him away. The railroad men slipped out quietly, abandoning their failed scheme. "Order!" The judge's gavel crashed down. "Mr. Stone, are you injured?" "Just a scratch," Andrew said quietly, though Alice could see him favoring his arm. The judge shuffled his papers decisively. "Given this new evidence and Mr. Trenton's violent display, I'm dismissing all charges against Andrew Stone. The land grant stands." He fixed Andrew with a stern look. "You've been cleared of the New Mexico incident as well. Self-defense in protection of innocence, according to the marshal's investigation." "Much obliged, Your Honor," Andrew said simply. The gathered crowd watched in silence as Alice helped Andrew out of the courthouse. Morning sunlight spilled across the street, making her blink back tears of relief. She felt the weight of their stares but kept her head high as she guided Andrew to their waiting wagon. Mrs. Hanley hurried over with clean bandages from her sewing basket. "For his arm," she whispered, pressing them into Alice's hands. "We're glad for the truth coming out." One by one, other townsfolk nodded or touched their hats as the couple passed. Not acceptance yet, perhaps, but understanding beginning to dawn. Alice helped Andrew settle onto the wagon seat, careful of his injury. The morning breeze carried the scent of spring sage as she climbed up beside him. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Andrew pulled the wagon to a stop outside the jailhouse. The afternoon shadows stretched long across the muddy street, and lamplight already glowed in windows against the darkening sky. "You don't have to do this," Alice said softly, touching his uninjured arm. Andrew's face was set with quiet determination. "Yes, I do." He climbed down carefully, favoring his wounded shoulder. Sheriff Wade looked up from his desk as they entered, surprise crossing his weathered features. "Stone? Didn't expect to see you back here?" "Need to speak with Trenton," Andrew said. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Come on, then." He lifted a ring of keys from his desk. Their boots echoed on the wooden floor as they walked down the short hallway to the cells. Jacob Trenton sat on his cot, staring at the wall. When he saw Andrew, his lip curled in a sneer. "Come to gloat?" he spat. Andrew stood straight, his voice steady and clear in the dim space. "No, I came to say I forgive you." The words hung in the air. Trenton's face twisted with rage. He lunged at the bars, fingers curling around the iron. "Forgive me, you self-righteous bastard! You stole my daughter, took my chance at wealth. I don't want your damned forgiveness." A stream of curses followed, echoing off the stone walls. Andrew didn't flinch. He simply closed his eyes and spoke quietly. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." Alice watched the sheriff bow his head, hat in his hands. The raw humanity of the moment filled the small space. Trenton's fury spent itself against Andrew's calm, like waves against stone. When the gambler finally fell silent, Andrew turned away without another word. Alice took his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles as they walked out into the gathering dusk. Rain began to fall as they left town, fat drops that drummed steadily on the wagon's canvas cover. The road turned slick and dark, washing away the day's dust. Andrew guided the team carefully through the gloom while Alice prepared bandages in the wagon bed. "Let me tend that wound now," she said when they were well outside town. Andrew drew the horses to a halt and joined her under the canvas. As she gently cleaned and wrapped his shoulder by lantern light, Alice whispered, "You did what no one expected today." The corner of Andrew's mouth lifted in a faint smile. His eyes held a peace she hadn't seen before, despite the pain he must have been feeling. "Mercy ain't weakness, Alice," he said quietly. "It's the hardest thing I ever did." She tied off the bandage and met his gaze. The steady rain continued around them, its rhythm soothing in the gathering night. Like the cleansing drops outside, she could see how letting go of vengeance had washed something clean in Andrew's soul, not erasing the past, but offering a way forward. The summer sun painted the valley in shades of emerald and gold. Morning glories climbed the cabin's weathered logs, their purple blooms reaching toward clear mountain skies. Where winter's isolation had once ruled, life now flourished in every corner of Andrew Stone's homestead. Mrs. Clara Hanley's cheerful voice carried across the vegetable garden as she showed two orphaned sisters how to thin the carrots. The girls had come to them in spring, their parents lost to fever. Now they giggled as they pulled weeds, their sun-browned faces bright with purpose. "Mind you leave the strongest ones," Mrs. Hanley instructed, brushing dirt from her apron. "They'll need room to grow proper." On the covered porch, Alice guided three women through the intricacies of quilting. Their needles flashed in the morning light as they stitched together squares of fabric, creating patterns that told stories of home and belonging. The steady click of needles mixed with quiet conversation and occasional laughter. Near the woodpile, Andrew sat with the young Ute boy they had rescued in late winter. The child's finger traced carefully along the lines of Andrew's worn Bible, his voice clear and determined as he sounded out each word. When he stumbled, Andrew helped him gently, speaking both English and Ute with patient care. "You read well, Thomas," Andrew said, using the Christian name the boy had chosen for himself. "Your people's wisdom and God's word, both are treasure." The preacher's horse appeared on the trail that afternoon, its rider smiling broadly as he dismounted. "I barely recognize the place," he called out, accepting the cup of water Alice brought him. "Townfolk have taken to calling it Mercy Cabin, you know. Fitting name, if you ask me." He stayed through supper, breaking bread with the extended family that had grown around Andrew and Alice's table. Mrs. Hanley's stew filled every bowl, and the orphan girls proudly served the biscuits they had learned to bake. As evening settled over the mountains, Andrew and Alice sat together on the porch steps. Golden light spilled across the yard, where the children darted about, trying to catch the first fireflies of summer. Their laughter echoed against the peaks, sweet and free. Andrew watched them with wonder in his eyes. "I never thought peace could be earned," he said softly, his scarred hands resting quiet in his lap. Alice reached over and covered his fingers with her own. "You didn't earn it, you gave it," she replied, "to everyone who needed it most." Later that night, after the children were asleep and the evening prayers said, Alice sat at the table with her journal open before her. The lamplight caught the gold of her wedding ring as she wrote, "They called him Ruthless once, but what mercy made of him shocked us all. Where fear and whispers once ruled, now there is laughter. Where loneliness darkened these walls, now there is family. The cabin has become what Andrew always was inside: a refuge for the broken, a shelter in the storm. God's grace works in ways we never expect, turning the darkest paths toward light. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.